The second part of this week's lecture from Barnett's Chapter 10 will involve us taking a look at intimate partner violence among special populations, and these populations involve immigrants, racial and ethnic minorities, and the two of them are those two topics are kind of blended together because of the fact that minorities often are immigrants, although not necessarily, of course. A little bit of attention given to the rural population and some of the special issues that individuals living in rural areas experience in terms of intimate partner violence. And this is something which, for those of you that live and work outside of Anchorage or any other, if you're taking this course from some other part of the country, any urban area, if you interact with individuals living in rural areas, there's some interesting things here that are worth keeping in mind when we talk about that population. Same-sex populations and also military populations also will be looked at, not in depth, but somewhat briefly. First, we begin with a look at immigrant and racial ethnic minority interpersonal violence, or intimate partner violence, I'm sorry. Of course, the cultural philosophies and lenses that we've been talking about, and we talked about in the first part of this week's lecture, have a lot to do with a woman's decisions about partner abuse and whether to leave and stay, and how to deal with that abuse. It's important for us to be able to understand, to be culturally competent enough to understand that individuals from different cultures view the concept of individual rights, obligation to family, those kinds of things very differently. There really, you can kind of, if you want to kind of simplify this, which we have to do sometimes, you can divide these cultures up into two different types. You have the individualistic and the collectivist cultures, and individualistic cultures tend to be more associated with industrialized and Western Hemisphere and Northern Hemisphere cultures, and so this would include the United States, of course. And in this sense, in an individualistic culture, parents raise their children to launch from the family, to go out and establish their own family, and to become independent. And so, while parents desire for their children to go out and do that, carrying on their own beliefs and carrying forward their own kind of sense of right and wrong and those kinds of things, nonetheless the adult child is expected to be independent and not rely upon the family. And likewise, in the bigger picture, parents are not expected to depend upon that young adult child as they age. Now, that's another discussion that involves, who takes care of our elderly and those kinds of things in our culture. But in any event, in an individualistic culture, the idea is everybody kind of takes care of themselves. Okay, that's sort of the basic key. And you raise your children to become a good individual. In collectivist cultures, which are the rest of the world, really, and again, this would probably be more Southern Hemisphere and Eastern Hemisphere. So we're talking about Asia, we're talking about Latin America, Africa, perhaps. These, particularly among those cultures where it is less industrialized, a collectivist flavor continues to become to be the primary way of seeing the world. And in this particular view of the world, children are raised not so much, the focus isn't upon helping the individual child go on to college and become a successful individual, but really to raise that child to contribute to the family unit. And so instead of becoming independent and launching on their own, adult children in collectivist cultures very much are expected to continue to recognize their connection and have a commitment to the family, and that whatever they do for themselves, they are also contributing back to that family group. That's the collectivist notion there. And so a lot of times, for instance, among young Latinos in the United States, who have perhaps a first or second generation Latinos who may be taking university courses and are very much into the individualistic kind of notion of the American culture as they've become acculturated. Their families, their parents and grandparents, perhaps being more traditionalists with their collectivist upbringings, there can be a clash oftentimes between the two generations, as the young Latino may expect to move away and establish their own life and get away from mom and dad, whereas the parents are really looking for that young Latino to contribute back to the family in gratitude and thanks, and allowing them to benefit also from his advances. So this is sort of a difference here in terms of the importance of family, I think, and how relationships are within family. And so you might gather from this that in a collectivist culture, the focus really is when you look at male and female relationships, then you can imagine that the focus is going to be upon the contributions the woman makes to the family, and not so much about her individual liberties and individual rights and egalitarianism and equality. Those are not things you're going to hear a whole lot of about in collectivist culture. And so all of this is really to say that when we work with people from immigrant populations, it's helpful first to kind of figure out what the worldview is for that particular population, because you may be asking individuals to make decisions based upon our worldview, which may be very, very different from their own. Now, this is an oversimplification of the concept of worldviews. This idea that you're either agree with us or you're different from us, that dualistic kind of thing. It isn't that simple, but this gives you a way of kind of understanding a little bit about some of the differences we see in cultures. Another factor, and this sort of ties into my comments about the young Latino college graduate a few minutes ago, that we need to understand the degree of acculturation of an immigrant person. And generally speaking, I've as a rule of thumb, I've heard that acculturation it takes 3 generations really from an immigrant family. That the family that arrives is still very tied to the old country and the cultures and traditions of that country. The second generation being raised by individuals who are very much into that old country philosophy, nonetheless must learn to function in the new culture, and so tend to have one foot in both cultures, so to speak. And then finally, the third generation, raised by the second generation who is getting into the new culture more fervently, is the one who becomes acculturated, let's say, fully as in the new culture. Again, a simplification of the process, but still something to help you understand a little bit about that. And so immigrants aren't all the same, and even first-generation immigrants sometimes are much more involved in the dominant culture they've moved to than others. And so it's important to understand how acculturated the immigrant is also in looking at this population. So what we do know is the rates of intimate partner violence tend to be higher among members of minority groups than among non-minority populations, and this is likely due, I should say, to socioeconomic factors. This isn't about race; it's about economics, and so don't look to biology to explain this. Look to economics. Minority populations tend to be excluded and not have equal access to the institutions of our society that allow them the same success that the dominant white culture has. And so understand that this is related to socioeconomics and not race. And when you look at history in immigrant populations in the United States, battered immigrant women were legally dependent upon their husbands, who were the working individual in most of those relationships, and men for the longest time have been able to in essence threaten to deport their wives if they didn't comply. And so really the Violence Against Women Act in 2005 gave immigrant women the right to self-petition for a green card, and so they can now begin to function independently in this culture. But even in our own culture, immigrant women were unusually dependent upon their husbands, including their abusive husbands, because of the way the laws are structured. Looking at some of the specific population of immigrants, African Americans, of course, there's been a fair amount of economic distress, and populations oftentimes have been concentrated in socially and economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, and so these are certainly key factors in terms of incidents of intimate partner violence. Also, because of cultural pressures, sometimes African Americans have a particularly difficult time disclosing abuse going on, and this has to do with not relying upon the institutions of the larger society, keeping the communities, um, self-respect, a lot of different kinds of things that play into that. Arab Americans, perhaps more than other groups, really have to deal with the strong, intense patriarchal belief systems of many of those cultures. And an example they gave was that 88% of Arab Americans in this one study felt it was very important for a woman to be a virgin before marriage. Now, taking, I think there's probably a lot of individuals in American society who think that's a good thing anyway, but what we're saying here is that this goes beyond that, and becomes a requirement of women in these cultures. It isn't something that women aspire to, and it's a much more intense belief. And again, particularly keeping in mind about some of these cultures also being honor societies. You can see that premarital sexual activity among this population, among women, can provide justification within their cultures, at least, for quite a bit of violence against them. Among the Native American population, women in this group are believed to be the most victimized among any racial or ethnic group in America. Not only do they have the problems with poverty and all the other things associated with life on reservations and so on, but there's historical trauma that affects many aspects of their lives. And the authors say that there's a sort of a learned helplessness that is a generational thing, a cultural thing that has happened with this population. And it's led to just very, very high rates of things like poverty. I think this is the poorest population among minorities, the least educated. They have the highest rates of violence, the highest rates of alcoholism and substance abuse. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that there's really poor law enforcement, limited access to services, a lot of racism, and so on. And so this particular population, who, of course, in Alaska we're particularly sensitive to, may have a particular problem when it comes to this topic. Among Asian Americans, there are strong cultural beliefs. Again, that kind of lean very heavily upon the male being dominant in the family, and the woman existing to tend to the male's wants and needs. And oftentimes the women in these cultures will not see her partner's violence as being abusive. Also, this particular culture, and there are other cultures, it's not just Asian Americans, but oftentimes individuals from these cultures are not comfortable disclosing problems to strangers at all, and so the notion of going to a counselor or calling the police, those kinds of things really are kind of anathema to them. We're in a culture where face saving is important, and where the man is the head of the household and determines how things are done. That really going to outsiders is something that really is opposed to a lot of those belief systems. And so, as the text puts it, their victimization often is invisible in our day-to-day living. Haitian immigrants have experienced and witnessed acts of violence, for generations, and this affects their attitudes about intimate partner violence as well. Wife beating is considered to be normal, according to some studies that the authors cite, and not only normal, but occurs openly in public and so on. The Latina population face many barriers to disclosure. Aside from language being an issue, there are many Mexican Americans, for instance, who have moved to the United States that aren't speaking English yet, and so that makes it very difficult for them to access services in our culture. And there's always fear of deportation. There's great poverty, those kinds of things, all of which may make women in Latino culture particularly vulnerable to intimate partner violence. keep in mind that this also includes the population of undocumented aliens or illegal immigrants, however they're referred to in the current lexicon, and those individuals are certainly going to be less likely to call the authorities into their home, again, because of fear of being sent back. So this is a population that is very, very vulnerable. But, as motives for partner violence varies among dominant white cultures in America, they vary among minority members by gender and culture, and by individual differences as well. I mean, all Latinos, all African Americans, all Asian Americans are not the same, and they don't all have the same belief systems any more than all of the dominant white culture in America might have. And so we have to keep in mind that we are talking about individuals and individual choices and decision making. For women, what they refer to as abuse-instigated anger sometimes function as a motivation for her violence against a male partner. This is, again, pointing to the fact that we're looking at female-to-male violence as being prompted most often by the fact as a reaction to male-to-female violence. And for the males in immigrant populations, there is a role strain that's associated with immigration and becoming acculturated into a new society that underlies some of the violence. There is this unrealized aspirations of males to be economically successful, to become, have a better life for themselves and their families in this new culture, because it's not easy getting established in a new culture, and as we've said earlier, a lot of the immigrant populations tend to be congregated, tend to be concentrated in areas where there is high crime and lower socioeconomics, those kinds of things. And so for the males who bring their families here, this can make them feel as though they aren't living up to what was expected of them, and creates a lot of frustration that will contribute to violence in their life. So you find some groups are more likely to call police for intimate partner violence crimes than others. I believe the text indicated that African Americans are more likely than white victims to call for police help in those situations. Asian American women being the least likely to call. And the indications from most of the studies that the text looked at least says that the police tend to treat partner violence crimes for minorities much the same as they do with non-minority partner crimes. But at times they concentrate less on the context of the crime, getting more involved with the violent crime itself, and so they may miss the self-defensive nature of women's actions in some of those circumstances. In other words, females being arrested and at times in those situations when, again, it's a reaction to male violence and not instigated by females themselves. This is true not only for the minority populations, but it's true also for the dominant white population as well. And as you can see, the next point, actually the next bullet point really doesn't make much sense, and that's because I didn't correct all of it in this. But basically, what it says is, the text points to some of the consequences of female or male to female intimate partner violence, including health problems and mental health problems, and the rest of this are things that I should have erased and replaced, but didn't. But the text talks about some of those consequences, which are not unlike the consequences that any female would experience, of course. But immigrant and minority population battered women, for instance, are at greater risk for HIV infection than other populations. And we also find that in cases of IPV among minority populations, the types of injuries often reflect the cultural tendencies. So, for instance, Asians are treated more for burns and scalding, and again, reflecting some of the things that are permitted in those cultures. Also, the likelihood that some cultures are less likely to seek help than others reflects some of the attitudes about the justifiability of wife beating from culture to culture as well. Some of the minority populations mistrust law enforcement, either because of the role law enforcement played in their own society before arriving in America, or because they feel as though they have seen mistreatment of others in their population by the structures of society. Sometimes minority populations don't know the resources available to help, and again, this may be a particular problem. May be a particular problem for those individuals new to this country who do not speak English. They're not going to know about the resources available to them, and so if you do encounter clients who don't speak the language, it's really important to try to find a good interpreter, somebody that you can rely upon to be able to communicate honestly what's going on with that person, and screen for intimate partner violence, particularly among wives that may be in vulnerable positions in these situations. There used to be this sense that among the traditional cultures in particular, that kinship networks were there to kind of catch people as they fell, so to speak, and to help them deal with problems such as this. But a lot of the studies are suggesting that this social support doesn't really exist as much as we thought in traditional cultures. And that might be because of the fact that those cultures may believe in patriarchal structure in the home, and that the women's place is not to challenge males, but to do what they're told. And and in fact, some of these cultures are found to encourage those women to stay in abusive relationships for that very reason. And again, other factors such as saving face in Asian cultures affect decisions like that. So these are things that will sometimes discourage reporting. Likewise, for decisions whether to leave or stay, it can be very difficult for women in minority groups, just like in any other group, but with some of these particular issues about cultural beliefs, sometimes it might even be more difficult for them. But one study did find that women, and this was particularly talking about African American in the African American population section, but I believe the study was talking about women of color in general. From the way I read this text, it said that women of color were more likely to leave an abusive relationship than Anglo women are, and that's an interesting finding. It's just something to give some thought to, because that sort of runs counterintuitive to the other things that we have been saying here. Asian women who choose not to leave, who do not leave, I should say, abusive relationships, are more likely to place a high value on maintaining the family and living in the patriarchal system. They probably buy more into some of those more traditional beliefs. Those who do leave are the ones who tend to be most fearful of their partner. An interesting thing here too, one study showed that 96% of Mexican American women in the study who were leaving their husbands needed welfare support after, and this brings a whole new set of problems and a whole new set of attitudes that get turned against them when they leave. It's another reason why I would discourage Mexican American women to leave. Minority women, though, experience 3 times the battering as non-minorities women do. So some of these factors, such as needing to rely upon the welfare system and being connected to these traditional beliefs, probably have a lot to do with that statistic. Now we move on to a discussion, a few slides regarding the particular issues involving interpersonal violence among rural populations. And the text says, I think really eloquently, that rural abused women live in an enclave of patriarchy. For individuals who have grown up and lived in a urban culture, it may be difficult to really conceptualize the isolation that individuals who live in rural communities, and I'm not even necessarily, this includes small towns in some respects, but also people living out in the country, away from social centers, so to speak. There is a great deal of isolation, social isolation and interpersonal isolation that is a dominant factor, is perhaps the most important factor in the way life is for individuals that live in rural settings. And this isolation, as we know about, and we talked about earlier in the semester, is one of the things that abusers and batterers can use sometimes in order to continue and to support the battering, because individuals in the family don't have people to talk to as much as you might if if you're in a community somewhere, or you're in an urban setting with a lot of resources around. Just because kids go to school doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily talk about what's happening in the home, and so there are all sorts of barriers to dealing with the problem of interpersonal violence for individuals living in rural settings. And I have such a hard time saying that word. Many more barriers for those individuals than than for those that live in an urban kind of setting. And it's things like social isolation. Sometimes individuals lack communications. For those of you that live in outlying regions, even from outside the Anchorage area, even maybe within the Anchorage area in Alaska, communications sometimes isn't the same out in the country as it is in the city. Cell networks are very spotty, and sometimes communication systems such as the internet and things like that, which is a given in a community, may not even exist in some outlying regions in the country. Transportation is virtually non-existent for many of those individuals. There is no such thing as confidentiality in small towns. Even among professionals, I'm not saying that professionals go out and talk about their clients in the community, but you bump into your clients as a professional in the grocery store or at the gas station or in church, and the fact that you know each other communicates to other people in the community who know what your role is as a professional in the community. It communicates to those other people that there's a problem in that person's life. And so confidentiality doesn't exist as it does in a more anonymous kind of culture of the urban setting. Less social support, less access to medical care, criminal justice response, both in terms of police response time as well as court dockets and things like this, is much slower. And you also find a lot more guns in the rural setting as well, which is another concerning factor when it comes to male to female interpersonal violence. As far as law enforcement concerns, look at that a little more specifically. The vast distances sometimes and the low staffing ratios of the law enforcement agencies in those areas is a factor which can affect their ability to respond to calls for intimate partner violence. The text also talks about the good old boys network of small communities, and this does actually exist out there. That is, a lot of times the arresting officers or the judges behind the bench or other individuals in the system actually know the batterer because they interact with them in other areas. Perhaps the batterer is, manages the local clothing store or runs the gas station or something like that, or is a member of a social club with them. And so this network sometimes tends to work against female victims. In an atmosphere which tends to be more patriarchal, more anti-woman, more anti-victim. And this fear of the fear that's created by patriarchal control of women, the textbook says, kind of creates a form of intimate terrorism. Some of the demographics about rural living: rural women in general are more likely to be white and more likely to be married. They are less likely to have a high school education. They're less likely to be employed, and they are less likely to have income over $15,000 a year. And so you can see here that many of these demographics make them more dependent upon the male. Comparing abused and non-abused rural women, then you see also that they're less educated, they're less financially stable, and they're more likely to have an abusive family of origin. That intergenerational transmission is pretty rampant among many rural populations. Something different from other populations. This is one group where the risk of partner abuse increases with age, not decreases. In other populations, the older you get, the less likely you are to be abused, to be a victim in an abusive relationship, but not in the rural setting. Rural batterers are more likely to have drug problems. I would say that includes alcohol abuse, certainly. And they're more likely to carry a gun or a knife, as we were mentioned earlier. So again, you think of the combination of those two, and that's a pretty frightening concept. As far as service provision goes, one study in 2005 showed that service providers assisted 18% of rural victims, whereas in urban settings, 44% of those victims of the same population were assisted. And so you can see that service provision for individuals in rural settings is much less than in urban settings. And so, left to themselves, sometimes you're going to find your victim in this setting to be relying pretty heavily on denial as a coping technique. And so, this is something that, again, to be aware of when you're working with this particular population. This is a group that has some very unique needs, and will need some extra creativity sometimes in addressing those needs because of the fewer services that are available to them, as well as all these other problems that are associated with them being connected to others. Now a few slides looking at same-sex intimate partner violence. As we've talked about in earlier lectures, there are a lot of myths about homosexuality that come into play when you start talking about dealing with this particular problem with this population. Homophobia, homonegativity, which is, I would say, heterocentrism is also another way of looking at that. Particular vulnerabilities of these populations all impact this population greatly. And the text points to some unique techniques in battering in this population, including things like the batterer threatening to out the victim to the public if that victim is not known to be gay or lesbian. The batterer is sometimes using heterosexist ideologies to convince the victim that the abuse is mutual, that it isn't it isn't abuse, so to speak, it's mutual combat. Even threatening victims to infect them with HIV is sometimes a technique that is used in this particular population. Now the problem this population deals with when it comes to intimate partner violence relates to the absence of laws that really acknowledge the viability of their relationships. In other words, the fact that there are, so few laws recognizing same-sex marriages or relationships of any nature, as well as, not only in terms of marriage, but in terms of healthcare and insurance and, authorizations for hospital care and those kinds of things. There's just a total dearth of laws as far as these relationships are concerned, and so the absence of these laws really complicates legal protection when it comes to same-sex intimate partner violence cases. For instance, protective orders may be more difficult to come by in some jurisdictions because they don't recognize the nature of the relationship. And as this slide says, even in particular studies about this population, it's difficult to study intimate partner violence in this population because of the fact that the data is skewed, because oftentimes local law enforcement agencies or legal systems or whatever will refer to these relationships as friends or acquaintances and not even capturing the intimate nature of the relationship. So we don't know a lot about how frequently IPV occurs in this population. Not surprisingly, homosexuals contact police far less often than heterosexuals, given the above. Again, this has something to do with the fact that I think it's safe to say both homosexual male and female populations, victims, don't elicit a lot of sympathy from the public. In particular, the text talks about lesbian female-to-female IPV victims experiencing little sympathy from the public, and this includes mental health professionals. The authors talked about one study that showed that mental health professionals have a tendency sometimes to hold lesbian victims responsible for their own victimization. It's something, again, thinking that it's perhaps easy to leave this relationship in their ideas, and I think that has something to do with the fact that there isn't a legal basis given to the same-sex couples, to establish and maintain their relationship. And the idea that interpersonal violence, as this slide points out, comes from patriarchal practices probably confuses a lot of people when they look at this in terms of female to female intimate partner violence, because there isn't a man involved here, and so it isn't about men controlling women or anything like this. And so you'll find a lot of times in intimate partner female to female IPV cases, it will be described as mutual combat, and it's important to recognize that while I think in general, it is believed that lesbian relationships are more egalitarian in nature, and probably are more so than the general population, statistically speaking. Nonetheless, there are more powerful individuals in many of those relationships that have the same kind of power that a male would have, let's say, in a relationship. And that doesn't mean that one's butch and one's femme, as the heterosexist kind of thinking is pointed out here in the text, but economics, remember, are a very important factor in determining who's powerful and who isn't. And so these relationships are not always egalitarian, and there can be a perpetrator, a batterer, and a victim. It is not always mutual. And so in the social service field, sometimes you may be interacting with policemen, that law enforcement individuals making arrests that see it that way, and it may be it may fall upon you to educate and to do some consciousness raising with some of your coworkers in other domains in the social service field. And you see here again a lot of heterosexist thinking and beliefs about same-sex relationships and things like that really need to be dispelled, I believe. And one other area that's a particular interest in this is clergy responses. The religious community, and many religions have a particular problem with homosexuality, same-sex relationships, same-sex marriages, those kinds of things. And I think for the most part you'd probably find that individuals in same-sex relationships don't turn to their clergy a lot for assistance because of this, but because it can be a real problem for those parishioners because of those attitudes. And so the text points out that it's important for pastoral counselors to be educated about this population and understanding its needs, whether one accepts the practice of homosexuality, so to speak, or not. This population continues to exist, and if the clergy is not able to provide them with help because of their belief systems, they need to be ready to refer them to individuals who can give competent help to them in situations such as this. Finally, we're going to spend a few slides taking a look at intimate partner violence among members of the military. And this is not a population that we've been looking at a lot throughout this semester, but IPV is a particular issue. Every now and then, you'll see in the news a story about a returning combat veteran who has murdered a partner or something along those lines, or committed suicide after murdering a partner. And sadly, this is not uncommon. The federal government, the text points out the federal government is providing more funding and more studies, but from what I have been told and have read, I think it is fairly safe to say that there continues to be a culture in the military that is not supportive of seeking help for mental health issues and these kinds of things. And there have been some studies. I've run into this in some other texts that I've used in other courses and things that suggest that the military actually, the military institution will limit the diagnoses and things, for instance, about post-traumatic stress and those kinds of things. And a lot of that has to do with concerns perhaps about having to provide financial support for those individuals with disabilities later. And so times when diagnoses should be made for mental or emotional problems among returning combat veterans, for instance, those diagnoses may not be made for that reason. And so there, according to much of what I've read at least, there continues to be a strong denial of problems, psychological and psychiatric problems in the military. Now, the problem of intimate partner violence is a particular category of problems in this, but and I think the family assistance programs on military bases and everything will address this problem when it comes up. But historically, intimate partner violence has been ignored in the field, in the military, because of bias. Well, first of all, against the bias against women in the military. But there have been studies that, and this is not surprising given that we're on a war footing in this nation, that over the last decade that there's been elevated rates of intimate partner violence for both men and women in the military, and that compared with non-deployed persons, those who have been deployed were more severely violent in those studies. Now, there are other factors aside from deployment that connects into intimate IPV rates, and this includes, it says, for instance, that there's a higher rate of intimate partner violence among soldiers who are not as bonded to their leaders than among those who are bonded to their leaders, and that's an interesting feature there. The culture of hypermasculinity within the military, which breeds all those other kinds of attitudes about patriarchy and male entitlement that sets up IPV in every population. Lower levels of support for female spouses, substance abuse, alcohol abuse among the military, all these kinds of things also contribute to the higher rate of intimate partner violence. Post-traumatic stress disorder is also touched upon in this text, and PTSD is something that really was a diagnosis that arose from returning combat veterans from Vietnam, in fact. While PTSD has been now is a much more common diagnosis given to individuals that experience any sort of trauma, and it's probably legitimately so. Where this originally resided was with the military and with combat veterans exposed to these things that in combat that we simply don't. It's outside the norm for a human being, and so the prevalence of traumatic events also among male and female veterans is high and extensive, and significantly higher than among civilians. And as you read this, I think we're looking at a list that includes things that have happened in the military to them, as well as things that have happened prior to them coming to the military. And you can see that there's high rates of trauma, sexual trauma, physical assaults, a pretty high rate of child abuse in their histories. And any trauma, 81 to 93% of the individuals examines have experienced one form of trauma or another, and so you can guess that among this population, then IPV rates may be higher. Veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder are significantly more violent, and the severity significantly correlates with partner abuse. So this is an area that needs to be recognized and acknowledged by the institution of the military and dealt with effectively, providing resources that are needed to returning veterans and their families. And in particular, the text points out that men with post-traumatic stress and war zone traumas should be targeted for IPV prevention efforts from the very beginning. This is an area that needs special attention. And for those of you who will have an opportunity to work on military bases and in mental health programs associated with that institution, this is an area that I would encourage you to pay particular attention to, and if you have any opportunity to provide prevention efforts, this would be well worth your time and attention. So with that, we'll conclude our lecture on Chapter 10 from the Barnett text. Again, as always, if there are any questions lingering from this or any further discussions, please contact me. You can email me, and I'll be happy to respond. Thanks very much, and have a good week.